Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Matt Huber and Kohei Saito in today's episode. Matt Huber is a professor of geography and the environment at Syracuse University and author of Climate Change as Class War: Building Socialism on a Warming Planet. Kohei Saito is a professor at the University of Tokyo and author of Marx in the Anthropocene Towards the Idea of Degrowth Communism. Kohei and Matt are prominent voices within an ongoing debate between Marxist Ecomodernism, or Promethean socialism, if you will, on one side, and anti-capitalist degrowth, or degrowth communism, on the other. I'm very happy that they have come together here on Future Histories to discuss not only their differences, but also the substantial overlap between their positions. One thing that Matt and Kohei can certainly agree on is that democratic economic planning will be an important aspect of any socialism or communism to come, which is why I wanted to use this opportunity to once again remind you that the edited volume on democratic planning that I co-edited with Christoph Sorg is coming out very, very soon. It's titled Creative Construction, Democratic Planning in the 21st Century and Beyond, and is about to be released on February 12th in the UK and on March 11th in the US. Kohei wrote a foreword, many interesting chapters. It's a great book, I would say, and I'm very much looking forward to the release. I'll put the link in the show notes in case you're interested, but now please enjoy today's episode of Future Histories with Matt Huber and Kohei Saito on growth, progress, and left imaginaries. Thank you very much for taking part, and welcome, Kohei, welcome, Matt.
Thanks. Great.
I had the pleasure of welcoming both of you in Future Histories before, but for those listeners who don't know your work already, could you briefly introduce your positions within this debate, and then we'll have a deep dive going from there. Maybe Kohei, why don't you start with a quick overview of what you have termed degrowth communism?
Yeah, my background is actually Marx's late thinking about post-capitalism, and I kind of like digging into his unpublished notebooks. And basically my thesis is that Marx, especially in the 1870s and 80s, dramatically transformed his vision of communism. This is mainly because he became more and more suspicious of technological development. And he came to recognize that those capitalist technologies are more and more destructive, not only exploiting humans, but also exploiting from nature. So he believed that some more sustainable ecosocialism must be radically different. And he tried to imagine a different kind of future by studying non-Western and pre-capitalist societies at the same time in the 70s and 80s. And he came to recognize that these pre-capitalist non-Western societies are actually much more equal, but also much more sustainable. And by learning from that kind of different kind of tradition, and he became much more ecological. In the end, my conclusion that he kind of abandoned that kind of like a Promethean of technology and development and progress. And so my thesis is basically that then the communism must be something really different from Soviet or Chinese type of socialism. And now I call this as degrowth communism. And this is one way of intervening into the current debate between green and red. And I'm trying to redefine the concept of eco-socialism by going beyond that kind of debate about, oh, Marxists are productivists, they don't care about the environment. No, it's not true. We can, I think, build together a much more sustainable and equal and just society, but without falling into kind of like a productivist vision that always seeks after infinite kind of growth, even after establishing socialism. So this is my basic standpoint.
Okay, Matt, how would you describe your position within the debate?
Let me try not to respond to what Kohei said first, but I will say I came at this really. I've been a long-standing sort of scholar of energy history and kind of, actually now like 15 years ago, tried to really situate like how can we think through the relationship between fossil fuels and the capitalist mode of production from a Marxist standpoint. And once I started really diving deep into the study of energy and particularly the transition of fossil fuels, through the work of people like Vaclav Smil and other sort of energy history experts, what you kind of realize is that the 19th century is quite an insane break in human history in terms of energy. We went through from a society in which 95+% of people worked in agriculture, to a new kind of highly productive machine-based fossil fuel-powered production, where all of a sudden most production prior to this was fueled by human and animal muscle power, and now you have this transition we call the Industrial Revolution that transitions towards automatic machinery. And of course, Marx basically was writing in the midst of that world historical transformation, and really thought, I would still contend, even in the 1870s, really felt that these world historical transformations in machine production really created some significant material possibilities for humanity as a whole, that really kind of created the possibility to abolish poverty, to abolish scarcity, to really automate a lot of dreadful toil that really, again, beset most of human society, most of human history prior to this moment. And of course, what he analyzed, particularly in the chapter on machinery and capital, is how under the rule of capital, this machinery is only harnessed in the production of surplus value and is sort of geared toward the exploitation of and domination of living labor. But as he says in a footnote in that chapter, under a communist society, this machinery could be used otherwise, right? And so my view of Marxism and historical materialism has always been that this industrial technological transformation really creates some material conditions and possibilities for communism and socialism that I do think Marx and Engels really carried that vision to the end of their life. But I think fast forward, over 100 years after their death, we really face a different historical conjuncture where we have an ecological crisis. And the question is, but we also have a world that is really dominated by this industrial form of production that Marx really analyzed 150 years ago. And the question becomes, how do we, in my view, we can't really take this world of 8 billion people, many of which that rely for their life on these kind of global supply chains of industrial forms of production. How do we take that world and transform it in an ecologically sustainable way that can also be attuned to these kind of more, I don't actually like the word Promethean. I would just say like emancipatory visions of freedom and free time, that I know Kohei shares this idea of, like, how can we harness these highly productive and efficient mass production technologies towards the goal of serving human needs, and also reconciling ecological problems and giving everyone sufficient material life and free time. And so that, to me, is sort of the vision of communism. So I think I'm rambling, but essentially what I would argue in my book argues is that I would say starting around the 1970s, you get a version of not only ecological Marxism, but just environmentalism in general, that is, on a broad sense, very sort of rejects industrial technology to court, right? They just sort of are very dismissive of these large-scale centralized industrial technologies and just want to sort of tear it all down and create much more smaller scale forms of production. And I don't think that's a very Marxist point of view. And I think, you can call it eco-modernist, but I believe Marxism was always a kind of very modernist type of, rooted in the Enlightenment, this sort of idea that that society was progressing through not just technology but also things like democratic enfranchisement and the French Revolution and all these kinds of things that are like progressing humanity, and that that really the only sort of way we can build emancipation for all of humanity is on the basis of this kind of industrial technology and not in rejection of it. And so that I think has been quite at odds with, again, the kind of degrowth and environmentalist kind of anti-technology or technophobic kind of perspective. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, we will definitely get to this question of technology later on in our conversation, because I think there's nuance to this, I guess. But before we do that, I would like to get into the question of growth. What are we talking about when we speak of growth? Both of you speak out against GDP as a measure of growth. Both of you want certain sectors to grow, others to shrink. However, there are indeed differences, I think, and the question of overall material and energy throughput seems to be the crux of the matter, I think. So in order to clear things up, the basics, so to speak, let's maybe start with you, Matt. What do you mean by growth when you say that growth is actually desirable?
Well, there are two ways I'd go about it. The first is to point out again that if you look at sort of just standard, even Marxist historiography, really what we would call sort of self-sustained economic growth does not exist in human history until this 19th century takeoff that, Eric Hobsbawm called like probably the most important event in human history, where you do get this new regime of technological innovation that does create this kind of growth, not only in economic terms, but in population. All this stuff starts to explode in the 19th century. But again, that comes alongside a number of big shifts of people out of agriculture into cities, and we must admit a large rise in living standards and medical advances and all this kind of stuff, right? And that is seen as a product of something that didn't really exist, which is self-sustained economic growth that sort of takes off around, I don't know, 1840 or so. But then in the post World War II era, you have this kind of, I would call it, many degrowthers call it like growthism, that you get this sort of ideological obsession with a statistical analysis of growth as this GDP system that is sort of supposed to be a barometer of the health of societies, and politicians and everyone else is kind of fixated on whether or not economies are growing or not, and that is seen as good if they are, despite, as you pointed out, all the kind of ways in which GDP kind of obfuscates the good forms of growth versus the bad forms of growth. So that is what I see kind of like a lot of the degrowth politics is really in reaction to and rejection of that kind of growthism and that growth obsession of post-World War II Keynesian kinds of political economies. But ultimately, I do think, as I just said, the problem with GDP growth is that it's abstract and it kind of bundles together all these different things that goods and services, some of which are really good, like building a childcare center. We would say that's good addition to GDP, but weapons production, we would say, is bad for GDP. I don't think, like, looking at an aggregate measure of growth either in GDP terms or, as degrowthers often do, as like material throughput or energy use, like these aggregate measures do not allow us to qualitatively determine what is desired for social needs and what is seen, what we want to eliminate or decrease, right? And that and so just our societal fixation on growth, in my view, should not lead to a negation of that with a sort of like aggregate focus on degrowing some sort of aggregate statistical measure. Because again, I think socialist planning demands that we actually take a much more qualitative approach that says we do want to grow a lot of important socially useful forms of production. We need to grow massive amounts of clean energy infrastructure. We need massive investment in public transit and public housing. And much of the global south doesn't even have basic modern sanitation services or electricity services. So there's a lot of growth of stuff that needs to happen, but that needs to come alongside a degrowth of military production, of fossil fuel production, of socially unnecessary forms of production. And so that's why I think the growthism or the growth ideology is not particularly helpful, but then just negating that ideology with a similarly aggregate focus on degrowth is also not particularly helpful in my view.
Kohei, what do you speak of if you speak of growth, and why do you say that we need degrowth?
Yeah, after listening to Matt, I think we share so many good points, and that's why I think the debate on website or like SNS is so meaningless. And I think it was kind of sad that I think we could have kind of merged to establish some kind of progressive eco-socialist vision together. Because the whole point of adding degrowth, communism, this communist part, totally shares what Matt says about technology and modern progress and all the necessity to overcome poverty, hunger, and disease, and all those issues. We need technologies, and we also need technologies for decarbonizing the entire economy. But my point is basically that doesn't really require infinite growth. Marx doesn't use the term growth at the time. He basically uses the term capital accumulation. But basically, when capital needs to accumulate, capitalists reinvest profit again to the production cycle. So basically, the CMC or like MCM, sorry, I usually talk in German, basically, this is a process of growing capital, and that's usually measured by GDP. So the point of using GDP makes sense to some extent, but after a certain point, it doesn't really make sense because GDP growth doesn't make us happy anymore. It doesn't really contribute to increasing our well-being. It's also not really measuring other important points like sustainability. So GDP can be increased by killing people, destroying the environment, and so on, right? So I think for the sake of really imagining a more sustainable and just society, we need to use a different kind of measure. And I think this point I and Matt totally share. And the problem is today's green capitalism or green growth kind of discussion, including the US form of Green New Deal, often assume that it's possible to separate the economic growth from energy and resource consumption. So it can even grow, but in a green way, so without destroying the environment. And it's good for the working class too, because it creates new jobs and it increases their salaries and so on. But the problem is, if we only talk about this kind of GDP and the money, these new jobs might also create more consumption by working class people. And that might also increase the extraction of resources, especially from the global south. That's also not so good. So I think, basically, degrowth is not anti-technology. At least I admit so we have to be a little careful. There are some forms of degrowth that are anti-technology and technophobic even. So I think the whole point of me as a Marxist or socialist advocating degrowth today is overcome this kind of technophobic weakness of degrowth tradition and bring some kind of progressive vision of the future without going back to nature. And then I think still in that sense, growth is necessary, no? But not in the sense of creating more, many unnecessary things in capitalism, but we have to focus then not simply on GDP, but we have to distinguish what's necessary and what's unnecessary. And capitalism only creates what's basically profitable. So maybe we need more essential workers. Maybe we need more care workers. And we also do need solar panels and public transportation. These industries and sections require growth necessarily, but we can reduce, the private car sectors and obviously like private jets and excessive domestic flights, excessive meat consumption. And these are the things I think we can democratically plan, but the capitalist market mechanism driven towards profit making doesn't really distinguish these kind of things. So I think GDP and the growthism are something that I think today we should really kind of abandon in discussing the alternative vision to current capitalism.
It's quite obvious that there seems to be a substantial overlap. You both see the need for growing certain parts and see the need for shrinking others. We have established that, but I would really like to kind of pinpoint this question of limits, because I think there is indeed some difference to be found. I mean, Matt, you kind of hinted towards not ascribing to even limits in terms of energy or material throughput as an aggregate. Maybe Kohei, you could speak on this question of limit, because within your work you use this language around natural limits. And maybe you could elaborate on what you actually mean when you talk of natural limits and why you argue that these are basically non-negotiable, but would have to be accepted by all of us, no matter what, more or less.
Yes. I think the problem of limit is very important because degrowth is also often criticized as some kind of Marxianism, and which is also unfortunate because we are Marxist and we don't want to be Marxian, right? But I think the problem of natural limit is something that we also have to recognize. It's also scientific concepts like planetary boundaries. Basically, it's natural limits, and I think recognition of natural limits or boundaries as such doesn't make you immediately Malthusian. I think this is just some basic scientific fact that there are things that you have to change. You can change. You can change certain natural laws. But that doesn't mean that these boundaries are just like very like iron law in the Malthusian sense. I would say that we can kind of negotiate with these limits using technology. So there are also certain social components to it. So this is more like a dialectical of relationship between what's social and what's natural, without really negating or transforming the natural limit into the social limit. I think that's the problem with like Harvey in the 70s, and these are the question that when those Marxists try to criticize when the Club of Rome Limits to Growth was published. But I think today it's a little bit different. I think natural limits are much more clear and quite compelling if we talk about climate crisis, for example. But my point is, I think the problem of some techno-modern kind of eco-modernist vision is basically we can just, overcome even those natural limits by maximizing technological development. But my point is basically, even if we try to do something, and even if that were possible, we wouldn't be happy and we wouldn't really enjoy communism. Why? Because I think problem of limit is often associated with problem of abundance. So why do we want to overcome limits? Because we want to live in abundant society. But I think the abundance is not simply also natural concept. It's also socially constructed, right? So even if we have many clothes or many new technologies, if there are always competition, if always someone having more or something new and something better, we don't feel happy. So we just kind of trapped into this endless competition and endless consumption. And we can actually today, especially in the age of ecological crisis, we should actually negotiate the concept of abundance. And that's what I try to do in my book by proposing this concept of radical abundance or communal luxury following Jason Hickel or Christian Ross. Basically, because we try to demonstrate that the capitalism artificially creates scarcity. And that's something creating poverty, inequality, and hunger, and many severe natural issues. Then that means that we can create different kind of social relationships, that we can create different kind of social abundance by commodifying basic goods and services. And then in such a society where education, medical care, public transportation, and all those things become decommodified, we don't need that kind of maximization of technological progress in order to overcome natural limits. We can establish some kind of social abundance within natural limits.
Matt, you kind of challenged this notion of natural limits. Could you explain your reasoning and what follows from this reasoning? And if you argue for limitlessness, which I at least saw in some of your texts, I'd like to know specifically limitlessness with regard to what? You are certainly not a climate denialist. You do not argue for limitlessness with regard to CO2 emissions, for example. So how do you navigate this question of limits, natural or otherwise?
I mean, in our review of Kohei's work, we actually acknowledge that there are always natural limits to growth, and that's just like a sort of ontological fact of human existence on planet Earth, that we sort of negotiate the constraints that the natural world presents to us. What I do have a problem with is what I do consider to be kind of a Malthusian legacy of projecting fixed, intractable limit that cannot be surpassed. And I do think this notion, the very notion of that there's this boundary, a planetary boundary, that when you cross, it's like from one domain to another, and then you're in this sort of danger zone, right? There's a planetary sort of Earth system scientist named Earl Ellis, who I think helpfully points out that there is no real safe space. We're already beyond where we should be on climate change. We're, cascading towards 1.5 degrees, and every little bit of warming makes the situation worse, right? So there's no magic boundary where if we hit 1.5, the world bursts in flames, right? There is kind of, I think most climate scientists can debate, like, are there these tipping points, blah, blah, blah. But I think most climate scientists just agree that the disaster of climate change is just going to get worse with every 10th of a degree of warming. And therefore, we need to put in a massive social mobilization to transition away from fossil fuels that's causing this. So getting back to I think if you look at the planetary boundaries literature, like they admit it sometimes, like they have a limit or a boundary for how much of the Earth's terrestrial land use surface can be used for human purposes, and they admit that they just sort of arbitrarily chose a level of like 25% as the boundary, right? And that is again, it's not so clear where this sort of fixed boundary is. Again, I've been a scholar of energy and particularly oil. My first book is on the political economy of oil. And what when you start to study oil is you realize that people have been predicting the end of oil, or that we're running out of oil, for over a century now. In the United States in the 1920s, there was a big panic about how we're about to run out of oil, and obviously the 1970s. And then I did my dissertation in the kind of peak oil mania. And the problem is that when the price of natural resources goes up, capital is unfortunately very good at finding new sources of these resources, and they have uncovered, unfortunately, way too much oil through fracking and other technological changes. And so all I would say is that we're not very good as a society as predicting where these limits are in terms of natural resource availability, in terms of ecosystem services and things like this. And I going back to something Kohei said earlier, I do think just rejecting out of hand the idea that we can decouple natural resource impacts from from kind of technological throughput, I think is just there are some studies that might try to say that's not you can't do that at an aggregate economy-wide scale, but there's lots of examples where you can look at a technology that has substantially decoupled the impact. And just so maybe we can debate a little more, I would say one example that I know we don't agree on is obviously nuclear power, where if you look at a pound of uranium gives you as much energy as 2.5 million pounds of coal, right? So this is an example of taking 1 pound of something that can give you the equivalent energy of 2.5 million pounds, right? So that is, to me, a very a classic example of how you could decouple the impact from energy consumption, because you're just extracting way less stuff to get way more energy. The energy density of uranium in this case is just sort of unbelievable. And also it takes a lot less land to generate that energy. So and again, a lot of these, one of the planetary boundaries we know is ozone depletion, and that was something that somewhat miraculously capitalists were able to come together, and capitalist nation states were able to come together to come up with technological changes that have led to the basically the hole in the ozone is now receding, and it's not as much a boundary anymore because of technological changes. It didn't require a degrowth of energy consumption or any kind of material consumption to address that boundary. It just basically required a societal commitment to technological change. And to me, that is, again, kind of where the climate change issue is. We're still a global society that relies on 80% of their energy from fossil fuels. And so therefore, there's going to have to be a massive civilizational mobilization to transition away from that energy source, and that's going to require fundamentally new technologies and fundamentally big investments in an entirely new energy system, right? And so that to me is, again, really recognizing the limits of climate change and saying that to address them, we need sort of a social mobilization and build out of clean energy that capital, as Brett Christopher's book shows, capital is not willing to make these kinds of mass investments in a clean energy system because they're not particularly profitable. So we need to kind of build up the political power that can force society to do these types of investments.
I would like to follow up on this because, I mean, at least within your text, now you're being a little bit more cautious, I would say, in the way that you phrase it. But at least within the text, it seems as if you are indeed saying that there is a limitlessness with regard to this technological innovation. So right now you argued that we might use nuclear energy in order to address the energy question, but within your text it seems as if this is a general argument that you would bring forward, that there is not really the need to think of this whole complex of questions in terms of boundaries or limits, because technology will eventually be able to transcend these limits, these what Kohei would call natural limits. So the question would then be, do you think there is a limit to this technological development, or are you just like really optimistic about the potential that lies within these technological developments? Because if not, then it would definitely require us to have a change in our attitude towards our own relation with nature as well, and not just bet on technological developments.
So very quickly, my position, I think the Marxist position is that the limits to our world are not in nature, but are in society and in the capitalist mode of production and social relations that shape how we interact with nature, right? And I would say that the reason why we are witnessing a massive ecological crisis is because capital has all the power and control over our metabolism with nature, and therefore, basically, the challenge is not to is basically one of a question of political and social power about how can you wrestle control away from those capitalists to control our metabolism with nature. And then once you do that, yes, you have to negotiate whatever limits exist, which again, the text you refer to, or I think we do say they exist, right? That it's again an ontological basis of human life on planet Earth, that we do face limits. But I would argue that it is capital that constrains how we can interact with the natural world, because it is only willing to produce stuff if it's profitable to capital. And therefore, we need much more social power to produce new technologies that can, again, I would argue, decouple our impacts on the planet. And I am optimistic that if we actually had social power over production as a democratic working class that actually was able to harness production for social need as opposed to just private profit, I am optimistic we could figure out the ecological crisis. Because what we have today is a situation where a small minority of humans direct the global metabolism with nature for their own enrichment and profit. And that situation is, again, careening us towards disaster. But I don't know if I'd call myself a humanist Marxist in that sense, but I am a humanist in the sense that I believe humans, if given the chance, can collectively plan and direct a production system in a much more sane and rational way than capital is currently. So again, I wouldn't say that once we seize the means of production, it's all easy and we'll just figure out every ecological problem like that. But I do believe that if we actually had social power to determine production, that we could start to, draw on the latest science, including maybe some of this planetary boundary stuff, to really decide collectively where are the ecological constraints that we face, and how can we plan production to respect those constraints and limits, but also how can we change forms of production to in some cases get supersede those limits, right? Because that's once you control production, you can kind of figure out ways to negotiate, and I would argue supersede these types of limits. But we're not going to be able to do that as long as capital is in power.
Right. So maybe just for clarification, and then I'll let you talk again, Kohei. At least as far as I understood it within the text, the argument is that it is a natural condition that there are limits, or that we kind of face limits, but that we then constantly are able to supersede these limits. So that you are basically arguing that there is a dynamic in place that is able to transcend these limits. And that was kind of the question, whether or not there are limits to this transcending the limits, And
in fact, I would say Kohei's first book, Karl Marx's Ecosocialism, is sort of an incredible study of how Marx started to recognize the limits that exist in soil fertility, and particularly the amount of nitrogen in soils and things like this. But what isn't really mentioned in that book is that about 30 years after Marx is grappling with these limits, you get something like the Haber-Bosch process, which does completely shoot through and basically supersede those limits to soil fertility. And you can argue there's been a lot of consequences ecologically of that shift towards synthetic nitrogen and chemical nitrogen. Others, again, I'm kind of a hardcore Vaclav-Smilyan. I mean, he's written a whole book on the Haber-Bosch process, and he claims, a third of humanity would not be alive today without this kind of huge increase in the yields and ability to grow from agriculture that came from this complete transcendence is a word I think I've been looking for a while of this kind of fixed nitrogen limit in the soil that Marx and Liebig and others were grappling with in the 19th century, and that by the end of the 19th century, some were predicting mass starvation is coming, but this was transcended by technological change. And now again, with 8 billion people, I think we have to really grapple as socialists, like how do we feed this world with or without this kind of chemical nitrogen fertilizer? If we're going to do without it, we really have to have serious ideas about how to replicate the kind of benefits that nitrogen fertilizer give us. But these are kind of very complicated questions, but it's a good example, I think, of how limits in one point in time become transcended throughout history.
Kohei, am I right to assume, I'm not quite sure, but am I right to assume that you might argue that this is not really a fix of the problem, but merely a shift of the problem? Or how would you kind of evaluate this example of quote unquote transcending the limits? Because one might argue that if you look at the broader context, the question kind of reappears.
Yeah, so I think we shouldn't underestimate the possibility of negotiating with natural limits through technologies. And I think we can have that kind of like chemical fertilizers and other inventions that really go beyond what Marx or Leigh expected in the 19th century. And that's a good thing. I think we totally welcome that kind of progress in order to overcome poverty and hunger and so on. But the problem is under capitalism, that kind of increase of food production is often associated with massive usage of those kind of like chemical fertilizers, pesticide, and other unnecessary things. In a way of this excessive usage is absolutely not necessary, because these are often utilized for producing more meat and other things, and these are really not the best, most efficient way of dealing with the issue of hunger, because meat is, after all consumed, not all, but a lot of them is consumed in the rich countries like America. And after listening to Matt, it's sad to imagine that the whole aim of socializing the means of production is to universalize the American way of life. That's not like the ideal way of imagining socialism. I think I think that for me, the climate crisis is a good opportunity to reimagine the post-capitalist future. That is not a consumptionist way of living. And it's also not imperial mode of living anymore, because that kind of excessive way of life in European, Japanese, or American societies is really possible only at the cost of many people and the environment in the global south. So it's not really about universalizing. I mean, many people, even in Japan, don't like that kind of a consumptionist lifestyle. But I think this kind of techno-optimistic discussion often accepts some kind of a capitalist ideal and the capitalist value standards. And that is not very revolutionary. And that also kind of avoids dealing with this issue of long history of imperialism and colonialism and the associated issue of extraction and the destruction of natural environment and the local indigenous life. And that problem is also related to nuclear power. For me, I became more ecological after the experience of Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. I was also more optimistic kind of socialist when I was younger, but I recognize, okay, after the earthquake, this Fukushima nuclear power just exploded, and I recognized people in Fukushima didn't use any electricity generated in this power plant, because all those electricity was basically sent to Tokyo, where I used to live. And basically, so this energy generated nuclear power supports this life in metropolitan cities like Tokyo, but at the cost of the countryside. And this same kind of antagonism between town and the countryside basically doesn't change since Marx's time, and it just became worse and worse. And nuclear power, maybe in other countries that without earthquakes, that might be safer. Maybe we have better, safer nuclear power plants. But we still have the issue of nuclear waste, also radioactive mining, and these are the people who are exposed to radioactivity, and these are often associated with this kind of very unequal power balance between capitalist center and kind of the margins in the global south, right? So I think socialism should really try to overcome not only the poverty of working class, but also this kind of associated structure of exploitation and oppression and other kind of like distraction. And I think this issue is, for me, a little bit not so clear when I read Matt's work. So I kind of wanted to hear how you kind of deal with this issue of externalization, colonization that also takes place with technological progress too.
Matt, you want to respond?
Yeah, number of things. The first thing is I really a lot of times my position is characterized as wanting to generalize the American way of life to the planet. And I would point out that my first book on oil is really a deep critique of what I consider the privatism of the American way of life. And I don't think really any socialist should want to organize society based on private transport and automobility and private single family housing spread out throughout. Talk about the countryside. I mean, the sprawl just sort of takes over the countryside. So this kind of suburban privatism is I think an anti-social geography, and is a very capitalist geography that socialists should not promote. And we should be advocating, again, I think Kohei would agree, like society based on much more collective forms of consumption, public transit and housing, to just name a couple. But I think this kind of notion of the American way of life as this sort of, again, very problematic, privatized way of living, very excessive, we can dismiss it on those terms, but I think we also need to acknowledge that there are parts of it that we do want to generalize to the global population. I would say everyone deserves to have indoor plumbing and modern sanitation services, clean potable water. I would say everyone should have electricity, and nearly 1 billion people around the world don't. Everyone should have access to heating and cooling. I think there's been this weird debate online about whether or not people should have refrigeration. I think they should. I think and Jason Hickel agrees, like having modern refrigeration is really a life-saving technology for human beings, and that we should have these things. But again, so there's kind of it's a middle ground. Like, no, we don't want a world of people living suburban, privatized, highly inefficient geographies, but we do want kind of universalizing sort of these basic amenities of modern industrial life that I think if you do go to the global south, you find that a lot of people actually do want electricity, they want clean water, they want these things. I mean, there's so much I could talk about the externalization problem. I mean, I would say the eco-modernists and the more classic variants of it, their whole shtick is actually that by making not only nuclear power, but also things like agriculture, by making them highly, and also cities, by making these things highly efficient in terms of their land footprint, you do this thing where you spare land for rewilding and for kind of more natural landscapes. So again, in terms of, again, I keep mentioning Vaclav Smil, but he wrote a whole book on the concept of power density, which is like essentially how much energy do you get per land unit of space that you use for that energy. And one of the problems is that the power density of fossil fuels is really, really high. We get a lot of energy from not as much land usage. But again, one of nuclear power's most incredible assets is that it doesn't take much land to generate just incredible amounts of power. So if you do want a non-exploited and rewilded countryside, I actually think nuclear power is pretty good because it doesn't take a lot of land. I actually live in the countryside outside of Syracuse, and one issue that a lot of people in my neighborhood are upset about are what I would refer to as these kind of private capitalist solar plantations that are coming to town and setting up solar farms on huge swaths of territory. And it's actually angering a lot of rural residents in my area. I think we can think about using as little land as possible to get as much energy as possible. And that, again, the eco-modernist vision of dense cities, I think, aligns very well with the degrowth vision of again, public transit, public housing, walkable, bikeable type of communities that I think a lot of degrowth would agree with that. Mining is, of course, can be horrific in the United States. Like the history of uranium mining on the Navajo reservation was done in with horrific levels of neglect and human rights abuses and environmental injustice. But there are currently, mines, uranium mines that are done in the parts of Saskatchewan in Canada, where a lot of the workers are unionized, and they are actually indigenous workers in these mines that actually see the uranium mines as good sources of jobs and development in their communities, and it's done in a clean and safe way, and it's not destructive. We know that decarbonization is actually going to require a fair amount of mining. Again, I would argue that there's a lot of mining involved with renewables, that there might be less mining involved with nuclear, but that's another discussion. But the question of the mining, how it takes place, I think is, again, it's a question of power and in the social politics of production. If you have capital in charge, they're going to come in and they're going to look after their profit, and they're going to externalize all the cost on the rivers and the lakes and the water systems and the land, and they're going to degrade the community and they're going to destroy everything. But if you're able to build up forms of social power, whether it be unions, but also I would argue, public ownership or publicly owned forms of production, you can start to build forms of production that try to take into account cleaner ways to do these things, more sustainable ways, and try to arrange these production systems in a more just way. So, I think, again, the degrowth impulse is just to say, shut down the mines and, let's tear it all down. But I think I think we could rely on a longer history of anti-colonial movements in the global South that were not really about shutting down production, but actually taking sovereignty, resource sovereignty, and taking control over their minerals and over their resources so that they could use them for national and development of the actual population. There's a dark history there. You have like in Iran, where an anti-colonial movement of Mossadegh, where he nationalized the oil, kicked out the Western oil companies, and then the British and the US coup them, right? You have similar situation that happened in Chile in 1973 and various other countries. But that moment in the middle of the 20th century was about global South countries taking control over their own production and taking control over their own resources to develop them for their own populations. And we're starting to see that kind of, I would call it developmentalist, kind of left-wing developmentalism, resurge a bit. Chile has, with their left-wing government, has proposed nationalizing their lithium mines to develop them for their own national sovereignty, but so has the left-wing government in Mexico. And so this is kind of, again, if there's going to be a green transition that requires mining, then that type of mining should be done under the control of the people in those areas, and they should democratically. And of course, if they decide they don't want the mining, then that should be respected, right? But I think the reason why all the mining is externalizes cost and destroys the ecology is because it's controlled by capital, and we need to build movements that overcome that.
Okay, so it seems that, again, the positions seem to be much closer together than an online debate might suggest, I would say. I would be interested in your definitions of progress and wealth, because I think this is also relating to this question of limits, or how to negotiate whether or not there are limits, and how to conceptualize this idea of a socialist society as a wealthy society, so to speak. So how do you conceptualize progress? Also, with the question in mind how countries from the South might achieve the standard of living that both of you basically argue for. Matt, do you want to start?
Yeah, because I don't know how much longer we're going to have, I might try to wedge something I wanted to make sure we talked about.
Please.
Which I think does relate to my vision of progress, which is basically, for me, like what Marxism comes from one of his quotes in kind of the early iteration of the International Working Men's Association, the first international, where he said the emancipation of the working class must be done by the working class themselves, right? And to me, Marx, in somewhat romantic type of vision, but I think a vision that he retained for all his life, it was this vision of proletarian working class self-emancipation, this idea that capitalism creates this kind of working class that is, I think, and this is something I try to argue in my book, is it's a really ecological story of the working class that he tells us, which is what capitalism does for the first time in human history is it rips the vast majority of humanity from the land and forces that proletarianized humanity to have to survive via the market, to sell their labor for a wage. But Marx argues that this kind of ripping of the proletarian majority from the land kind of creates this universal class that has the capacity to be, as people called it, the last class, the class that can abolish all classes and usher in human emancipation at a planetary level. And for me, that vision really is starkly needed today, because we actually face this kind of planetary crisis of our global production system. And again, a lot of, as we learned with COVID, a lot of the commodities that are produced rely on these planet-spanning planetary supply chains that kind of, require several countries just to assemble certain products into one commodity. And humans in whether it be Latin America or Europe are all sort of reliant on these planetary modes of production. And it's this planetary mode of production that is now sort of, again, careening us towards ecological crisis. So we do need a vision of a kind of global subject of political history that could kind of build this kind of movement and power to seize these planetary forms of production. And that, to me, where Marx's vision of working class self-emancipation was always a planetary or a species-wide or a sort of human-wide kind of scaled emancipation. And now, of course, we don't just need to emancipate humanity, we need to kind of save humanity from capitalism, right? When he was writing, you could argue that even like in a country like France, 50+% of the population was still the peasantry, right? But now we live in a world where upwards of 70-80% of the planet is proletarianized, and people have been depeasantization has kind of become a planetary issue. So you really have created this kind of vast global proletariat. And so that to me is kind of the vision of that as at the core of Marxism. And again, it's a vision of this majority of humanity kind of rising up to take democratic control over our metabolism with nature and then governing it in a rational way, as Marx kind of put it in Volume 3. So that just the last thing I want to say is that is actually a thing I think that's really lacking, and it's in my book. I think the degrowth politics there, and also in Kohei's analysis, there's no role of the working class. There's no mention much of the proletariat or of the working class majority or of workers themselves as being agents in transformations. Like this role of working class agency, I feel like is really lacking, not only in degrowth scholarship, but even I would even argue in the long trajectory of what is called ecological Marxism. Like a lot of ecological Marxists really kind of took as their starting point that, well, there were these old social movements that were rooted in labor and rooted in the working class, and those have kind of failed. So now we need sort of new social movements that are going to be anti-war and anti-racist and environmentalism is one of these new social movements. So we'll just sort of kind of craft a new Marxism to channel this kind of movement of movements, as Michael Lowy often puts it, to be the new kind of agent of change. In my view, that vision, which I think has its roots in the 1960s, has just not worked out, right? All we've seen in the last several decades is capital has gotten more powerful. Neoliberalism has eroded all the kinds of social safety nets that exist. The working class as a whole has become more precarious, right? And so that's where I really think the vision of the degrowthers are really lacking about is what is the role of the working class. And again, one thing to point out, and I meant to say this earlier, is that when we talk about the workers in rich countries as living these kind of excessive hyper-consumption lives that Kohei was saying earlier, I think we underplay the extent to which huge swaths, if not majorities of these rich countries, workers are actually living quite precarious lives, are really struggling. There's now a cost of living crisis. This is really shaping the politics of global power right now, where basically the cost of living and inflation has led to, you could argue, electoral outcomes in my country and other countries. And so Marxism really should have an answer for like precarity, cost of living crisis, inflation. And I don't think, I think we really have to get away from this view that sort of most of these rich countries are living these kind of excessive overconsumption lifestyles, and they are destroying the global south. That I think we need, again, to kind of try to figure out how to build kind of international webs of solidarity between precarious workers, global north and south, to kind of unite against the real enemy, which is the global capitalist class, right? So that's, again, my view of progress is working class self-emancipation. So.
Kohei, would you like to respond and also kind of address your idea of progress?
Yeah, I think, today it was very productive in a sense that we have meaningful debate, because I think Matt understands my position better, rather than simply dismissing as some kind of like Stone Age communism, going back to nature, technophobic and so on and so on. I think I have to make it clear that global south needs more growth. And I'm not anti-refrigerator guy. I even support iPhone. I think we should have iPhone. Of course, it's an open source version of iPhone in communism too, because these are the things that absolutely necessary for establishing more democratic and more sustainable society. Otherwise, we all have to meet up somewhere in New York or in London to do this interview, and this is absurd, right? And I think so, in a sense, decoupling is taking place, and thanks to technology. But the problem is often in capitalism, those technological improvements are wasted because companies produce even bigger wasteful products. I think the most clear example is electric vehicles. Like Tesla is producing this gigantic truck, and this is just nonsense. And these are the things I think eco-socialists have to criticize, because that kind of abundance, that kind of wealth, that kind of image of independence, freedom, or whatever must be radically challenged and redefined in the socialist struggle. And this socialist struggle, I kind of understand. I don't emphasize enough this working class subjectivity and struggle and so on. I think it's partly because in Japan, simply we don't have much working class movement. It's super weak. And that kind of discussion doesn't really attract people's attention. And I try to write in a popularized manner to sort of get some attraction from the wider audience. And I had to choose a different kind of strategy and terminology. But that doesn't necessarily negate the importance of class struggle. And I also understand totally through my social activism that even the working class people in the global north are really suffering from inflation, precarious wage, many issues. But my point is basically that doesn't really require, in order to mitigate their sufferings today, we don't need dream technologies, right? We don't need also growthism either. I think we can manage much better with redistribution and other measures such as decommodification, expansion of basic services and public services, more progressive taxation, including wealth tax and so on, but even reduction of working hours. And these are often policies that the degrowth people advocate, and these are not anti-working class. These are rather, I think, pro-working class. And that's why I think the kind of alliance of degrowth movement and the socialist movement is possible and necessary, because I think we are now both concerned about poverty, history of colonization, worsening of climate, ecological crisis, and so on. I think so. We share so many things that we both acknowledge the root cause is capitalism. Then we don't really necessarily. It's not that necessary to constantly debating over this kind of, techno dream and so on. I think we do share so many good things, and I think today it was very meaningful. I think one last point for me is I think it's very important to redefine those basic concepts like progress, emancipation, and wealth, and so on. If wealth is associated with money, big cars, big properties, in socialism, everyone becomes richer, but then that's very bad for the environment. If the progress is associated with nuclear fusion or other kind of the dream technologies, it just takes so much time, and we just lose the moment of making that transformation now, today. And emancipation is not about simply transcendence of natural limits. It can be other ways of imagining these socialist ideas. And I think that's very important to redefine the concepts for the sake of rebuilding working class movement, because I think today still working class movements are seeking after higher wages, but for the sake of consuming more big cars and so on. It's not today possible, unfortunately. I think we have to build new value standards that pivot around care, subsistence perspective, community-based I don't know, whatever activity, mutual aid, and these are, I think, new concepts. I think that's something Marxists or socialists need to actively learn from ecofeminist or anti-racist or like decolonial movements. And without doing this, rebuilding strong social labor movements sounds a little bit like Trumpism. Strong working class, make great American working class again, great again. And then that can be like anti-China, very like a resource nationalist, anti-even immigrants, working class movement. That's not progressive at all. So I think that we have to overcome certain negative legacies of Marxism and socialism, like male-centered, productivist, and the Eurocentric or like Western-centric view of emancipation. And I think for that sake, degrowth ideas are important. And these are also things that Marx also came to recognize. He didn't know the term degrowth, of course, but he came to recognize this kind of issues after studying non-Western societies.
Matt, this was interesting. The final part. Is this something that you would get behind? Basically redefining these imaginaries of progress and wealth in the way that Kohei just described them?
Well, I think Kohei and I agree that we need a socialist vision of, or an eco-socialist vision of wealth and abundance would not be based on sort of material consumption, acquiring the most toys and gadgets and material things, but that it would be about, what degrowthers call conviviality. It'd be about, like time, leisure to develop one's talents as a musician or whatever, but also to spend time with family and friends, to have parties and festivals, and to actually have, this sort of joyous kind of time that is for human development, right? And that's what capitalism doesn't give us. We're all exhausted, we're all burned out, we're all kind of anxious, and so therefore really I think a vision of a socialist future has to be about freeing us from that kind of exhaustion that capitalism presents to us. But I do think in the context of neoliberalism, where workers, even in the global north, have suffered decades of austerity and wage stagnation, like, no, I don't think we should be worried about workers fighting for higher wages. We're not, and I do not think we should assume that those workers are just fighting for bigger cars or more. Again, a lot of workers in our country are really struggling to I wish I had the stat off the top of my head, but the amount of people that are paying over a third of their income for rent right now or housing cost is just through the roof, and people literally can't afford a roof over their head and are making really terrifying life decisions about, are you going to pay the heating bill this month, or are you going to be able to put groceries on the table? These are real struggles that I think the majority of people suffer in a neoliberal, unequal capitalist society, and that and that, like, I think Marxism was this. I don't really agree that it's a masculine or whatever the other things. That it was a historical vision that, like, again, capitalism tears this proletariat majority from the land, and so that majority then can build a new associational mode of production off the basis of that capitalist mode of production. But with all due respect, like, this sort of ecofeminist, like, subsistence perspective, and we should all sort of go back to subsistence livelihood, that makes sense for small corners of peasant communities, indigenous communities, but for the vast majority of the 8 billion people on this planet, that is not going to cut it. We need to figure out how to provision 8 billion people where a huge majority of them rely on these capitalist forms of provision, right? How are we going to provision that majority? It's not going to be through this sort of community small scale production, mutual aid, and all the stuff that I think degrowthers are a little excited about. It's going to have to be about really large scale production. And again, I think it's a lot more than redistribution. It's not just like we just take what exists in the world and move it around to the global south. Again, we live in a world 80% powered by fossil fuels. What that means is a massive a program of world building or rebuilding or a complete structuring of the infrastructure that underlies billions of people's lives. And that's going to take total new construction projects and building and energy systems transformation. It's, again, I like to refer to it as a civilizational type of transformation. It's not redistribution. It's a production. It's a system. It's making a new mode of production, right? And I just, as you know from what I've written, like I just don't agree that Marx came to view kind of non-Western societies as the basis for communism late in his life. If you read the drafts of the letter to Verso, he's very clear that yes, these rural communes could transition to communism if they appropriate the benefits of that capitalism that exists in the West, where he said there would have to be a proletarian revolution in the West for this transition to happen in Russia, right? He also says very clearly that these somewhat static rural communes in Russia would need to appropriate technological advances of machinery and agriculture. He says that very clearly as well. So, I think a lot of environmentalists are anti-modernist and don't believe that the industrial systems of production have ushered in any kind of progress. Marx just wasn't one of those people. He thought this, again, I think this development of the productive forces that happened with the Industrial Revolution created a historical possibility for humanity to abolish poverty, and I think he thought that there's no reason why those rural Russian communes couldn't be swept up in a world revolution in a way, and that also, as Kohei pointed out in his book, like we can learn from the more communal associational forms of production that the rural communes represented. But he's also very clear that they have to appropriate these kind of industrial systems of production and so forth. So there might be a moment where the ecological crisis is so dire that we do need to everyone needs to hunker down and localize and kind of create these what people used to call transition towns, where we're kind of like trying to completely localize economies into going back to kind of subsistence economies. But that's not a Marxist vision of the future. To me, that's a very apocalyptic, a survivalist, anarcho-primitivist vision of the future. If we're going to be Marxists, we have to still hold out the hope that we still live in this moment of historic opportunity where we could seize these industrial forms of production and create a new world that could give everyone material sufficiency and free time and freedom, right? In that Marxist sense. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Very good. Kohei, could you speak on this notion of a historical vision, as Matt just called it? Because I think there might be some differences there, no?
Yeah, and I'm also changing my mind. I was more optimistic. I thought that we also have this, historical moment when we can kind of utilize this crisis to criticize capitalism and build a new emancipatory future. But that was like 4 or 5 years ago that I wrote my books, right? And now I'm working on a new project here in Hamburg, Germany, which is about war economy. And the situation here, I loved Germany for many, many years, and I even got my PhD here. But, the recent things about genocide in Gaza, and these are really disturbing, like how the German society, like this kind of European ideas about human rights, democracy, and everything seemed to me collapsing. And that's like a really, for me, like a almost personal crisis. No, I don't really personally belong to this Western tradition because I'm Japanese, but still, I was someone who was deeply inspired by this kind of like modern progress and the modern enlightenment and so on. But this is even including climate crisis and everything getting so worse and worse. In that sense, maybe we have to rethink that kind of the vision of emancipation. The left still has this vision that we can utilize crisis to overcome and then achieve emancipation. But that might be too optimistic today, even with those technologies. I mean, I'm not anti-technology. I just want to emphasize again, I'm not, go back to some kind of anarcho-primitivism. I'm against that kind of idea. That's why I'm socialist, I'm a Marxist, and that's why I think the degrowth communism is the real synthesis of both good aspects of degrowth tradition as well as socialist tradition. However, I think this idea of negation of negation, we could say, to present something positive out of crisis might be something that we have to give up. But this is a new project that I'm working on, and you will read it like next year or so. So maybe that's a good ending.
Right, but maybe not yet the ending, because I mean, what I would still like to know is if you would subscribe to this historical vision of historical materialism, because to me it seemed as if this was something that you do not really share and that Matt is really very much agreeing with, actually, and that this is a real divide between the two positions of yours. So I would be interested if you would agree with this notion of the historical vision that Matt just described.
Yeah, basically that's related to what I just said. So this historical vision, historical materialism, or whatsoever, it's about we can utilize some even those negative tendencies in capitalism. It creates alienation, it creates exploitation, but capitalism can be utilized to build some better society. That's a negation of negation. And historical materialism is about how those productive forces prepare material conditions for the better future, emancipatory future, and so on. But as Marx became much more conscious, these technologies are simply too destructive, too negative. It might be like we can say absolute negation. Yeah? So it doesn't really create anything positive anymore. And that's something what we are witnessing. It's climate crisis, war, and these are the things that we can not utilize maybe to build some better emancipatory future. So that's the direction that I started to take together with Marx in the 70s and 80s. And I think this is also what Marx was quite disappointed with the results of the Paris Commune. And after 1972, the older conservative force become much more active in the Western European countries. And of course, in a sense, his only hope was Russia. Maybe he romanticized a little bit too much and so on. But I think this led him to recognize how this historical dialectic was not something that, possible anymore. So it's really important that what Marx didn't finish his project, and we don't know the clear answer. And I'm using those notebooks, and it's a little bit, sometimes unclear because I'm taking certain passages and notebooks and letters and so on. I admit, but at the same time, these are the things that even Marx was trying to struggle without providing a clear answer. And these are exactly the questions that we are today facing and confronting. The capitalism is really destroying the planet without producing anything positive. Working class movement, environment, ecological movements, all just scattered. Is it because the left wing sucks? It's maybe it's something that we really reflect all over the project of emancipation and freedom. So that's my kind of project that I'm working on.
Okay, so I think we're close to the end. Maybe before I ask my last question, Matt, is there something that you would like to add to this last part? Because I'm still kind of wondering if, for example, if we do say that historical materialism is not like the force of change, so to speak, if this is the underlying assumption, then the question pops up, what then is the structural driver if it is not historical materialism? To me, at least, it's an open question still. Matt, maybe.
Let me
Yeah.
first say I'm excited to read Kohei's new work, because actually, coincidentally, I'm kind of working on a similar project. I think personally, I've also been just so horrified by the genocide in Gaza, and it really does force you to realize that the other big big topic in sort of Marxist debates and Marxist history is imperialism, right? And I tried to write a book that took the ecological question seriously through a pretty narrow focus on class theory and class struggle and what is class and class struggle. As many critics pointed out about that book, it doesn't really talk much about imperialism. And I think that's a foundational question of Marxist politics, is imperialism. So my new project, and I don't think you'll read it next year, but well, actually maybe next year. But this summer I haven't really started writing it, but I've just been reading and reading. And I think really Marxists have to rethink the relationship between ecology and imperialism, and what the relationship between particularly U.S. empire is and the global ecological situation. So that's what I'm working on, and I think thinking more about things like the war economy and geopolitical tensions and nuclear, not power, but nuclear weapons has been occupying my thoughts lately. So getting back to the historical materialist question, I think to me, like again, I think in Kohei's account, like the Promethean Marx really is perhaps most personified by that 1859 preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy, this kind of somewhat schematic and some would say mechanical vision of the relations of production and the productive forces. But to me, if you reread that preface, it could not be a more clear statement of what we face today ecologically, because it says there becomes a certain moment in history where the relations of production become fetters on the need and development of the productive forces. And that's when an era of social revolution comes. Right? And to me, again, we are faced with a society 80% powered by fossil fuel. It's very clear to get off that society, we need a massive development of the productive forces. I mean, that's what we call the energy transition. That's what transition away from fossil fuels requires. But of course, that, again, as Brett Christopher's book shows, the relations of production, the fact that energy investment is controlled by capital is fettering our ability to invest and implement this energy transition. So it's just such a clear statement of Marx. And again, in Capital, I know Kohei sort of analyzes that Marx had some shifts in Capital, but he does footnote the preface in Capital and says, this is my view, right? Like this is his view of historical materialism is in that 1859 preface. And I do think I really do think the 21st century is coming towards this kind of world historical crisis of this fossil fuel mode of production, and as Marx said, that's when there has to be this kind of revolution, right? Where the fetters are overcome by some kind of social force that can take the fetters off, right? And actually lately I've been thinking a lot about how there's a similar dynamic in the 19th century, where you did have just, decade after decade, it became increasingly clear that the slave mode of production was just out of sync with emergent political philosophies of equality and freedom and all the sort of bourgeois ideals, and that there became this kind of world historical clash that kind of had to happen with this mode of production. And it was, in my country, it was bloody and awful civil war, but it did require a revolution and an overthrow and an abolition of that mode of production. And that's where I think we're headed in the coming decades. That capitalists are always going to try to say, hey, we can solve this problem through tax credits and through market carbon pricing and all this kind of neoliberal ideas. But I think it's really about power over production and class struggle over this production. And it's going to come to this clash because, again, going back to what I said before, it's very clear that the social relations of capitalism are really fettering what we need to do to solve these ecological crises.
So there's a last question that I ask all of my guests, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful? Kohei, you want to start?
Yeah, I'm recently very pessimistic because just the all the decline, the marginalization of environmental justice movements that were massive a couple years ago really faded away in the recent years. And even though the climate crisis is increasingly real, even in the global north. So that really made me, confused, and I'm not very joyful and optimistic recently. But I think it's there are people who still work on this kind of topic, and actually, I'm usually in Japan, and Japan is really conservative, and only me talking about communism almost. So it's really glad to coming to Europe or to the US and you guys, and I meet now I'm in Hamburg with Aaron Benanaf and other people in Berlin, and it's really great, and I feel like, oh, I'm not alone. So it's the moment that I become more joyful.
Matt, and you?
Yeah, trying to remember what I said the first time I was on the podcast. I'm hoping I don't repeat myself, but again, I sort of see this pretty straightforward, that we've lived in kind of decades of neoliberalism where capital has been all powerful, and that I think in a very classically Marxist way, I think the only way that will be reversed is if the working class gets organized and the working class starts to build forms of organization that can fight back. And I think, again, the sort of theory that I think Marxists should have is that the working class has these kind of special attributes that give it the capacity to fight back against capital that no other source in society really has. And so I feel joyful when I see the working class in motion, like actually fighting, going on strike, and winning transformative gains for their for workers, right? And so it's not enough, but we have started to see, not just in the US, but globally, kind of green shoots of a resurgent militant labor movement, and particularly inspired by what the United Auto Workers did in the United States, the stand-up strike, and winning a record contract for their members, then winning a union in the U.S. South that had never happened before, that auto plants, and now they're trying to set all their contracts for May Day in 2028, and they're trying to organize a kind of real kind of building up of working class organization and struggle towards this, which will be yet another sort of world historical U.S. election in 2028. I think basically, if we're gonna save the planet and solve climate change, it starts with a powerful labor movement, and only with rebuilding the labor movement will we have the social power to kind of wrestle part of the social surplus away from capital and invest it in the kinds of things that we need to solve climate change, but also solve the cost of living crisis, and in my country, we don't have healthcare for people, we don't have childcare, we don't have housing, and so that starts for me with a resurgent labor movement. And I would hope not just in the union domain, but also in a political domain of kind of building up, political forms of organization that try to kind of create a program, a working class program that can include these kinds of things that degrowthers agree with, like universal public services and decommodifying survival, and sort of like those kind. If you actually want to win those types of policies, you need, in my view, working class power. So when I start to see working class building towards power, that's when I feel joyful.
Wonderful. Thank you both for being part of Future Histories.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.